The fuel gauge needle trembled empty as Captain Sarah Chen watched the storm roll in from the west, its dark wall of clouds swallowing the desert horizon like a hungry beast. She pressed her palm against the cold metal of the hangar wall, feeling the vibration of thunder still miles away, but already making the entire structure hum with anticipation. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the metallic scent of approaching rain, creating that particular cocktail of anxiety and adrenaline that every pilot knew by heart. "Storm's moving faster than predicted," called out Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez from across the hangar, his voice carrying over the mechanical symphony of pre-flight checks. He was kneeling beside the landing gear of an F-16, his weathered hands running along the hydraulic lines with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been maintaining aircraft longer than Sarah had been flying them. "The weather's calling for zero visibility in 40 minutes. Sarah nodded, though her attention was fixed on the figure emerging from the shadows near the squadron commander's office. Captain Jake Morrison walked with the kind of swagger that came naturally to pilots who had never been told they didn't belong. His flight suit crisp despite the humidity that was already making everyone else's clothes stick to their skin. His eyes found hers across the hangar, and she saw that familiar flash of something that wasn't quite contempt, but wasn't far from it. "Chen," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never had to prove he deserved to be heard. "You're not seriously planning to take that bird up in this weather?" That bird he referred to was her F-16C tail number 870257, a machine she had come to know better than her own heartbeat over the past 18 months. Every rivet, every wire, every quirk of the engine's personality was cataloged in her memory. She had flown this particular aircraft through sandstorms over Iraq, through the knife-edge precision of aerial refueling operations over the Pacific, and through training exercises that had pushed both pilot and machine to their limits. The aircraft bore small scars that told the story of their partnership. A tiny dent in the canopy frame from a bird strike over Nevada, scratches on the landing gear from a hard touchdown during her first carrier qualification, and the faded outline where her name had been painted and repainted as she moved through different squadrons. "Weather window's still open," Sarah replied, keeping her voice leveled despite the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Morrison questioned her judgment. "Tower cleared us for takeoff in the next 20 minutes. Morrison's laugh was sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the hangar like the crack of a whip. "20 minutes? You'll be lucky if you can see the end of the runway by then." He gestured toward the approaching storm with a dismissive wave. "This isn't about proving something, Chen. This is about making smart decisions." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Sarah felt them settle in her stomach like stones. She had been hearing variations of this conversation for the better part of 2 years, ever since she had been assigned to the 142nd Fighter Squadron at Nellis Air Force Base. The subtext was always the same. She didn't belong here, she was trying too hard to prove herself, she was a risk to herself and others because she couldn't accept the limitations that everyone else could see clearly. Lieutenant Ana Vasquez looked up from the maintenance log she had been reviewing, her dark eyes catching the tension that was building between the two captains. Ana was one of the finest avionics technicians on the base, someone whose opinion carried weight even among the most senior pilots. She had worked on Sarah's aircraft more than anyone else, had been there for every pre-flight briefing, every post-flight debrief, every moment of triumph and frustration that came with military aviation. "Captain Chen's bird is in perfect condition," Ana said, her voice cutting through the tension with the authority of technical expertise. "All systems green, fuel load optimal for the mission profile, and weather radar is functioning at 100%. She closed the logbook with a decisive snap. "If anyone can handle this weather, it's her." The hangar fell quiet, except for the distant rumble of thunder and the steady hum of the air conditioning systems working overtime against the desert heat. Sarah felt the weight of multiple gazes, some supportive, some skeptical, all waiting to see how this moment would resolve itself. She had been in similar situations before, moments where her competence was questioned not because of her skills or her record, but because of assumptions that had nothing to do with her ability to fly.
Morrison's expression hardened, and Sarah could see him weighing his options. As the squadron's most senior captain, he had influence that went beyond rank. His opinion carried weight with the squadron commander, and his approval or disapproval could affect mission assignments, promotion recommendations, and the thousand small decisions that shaped a military career. "The mission profile calls for formation flying," Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a final argument. "Close quarters navigation through the canyon system, precision timing for the target run, and coordinated egress under combat conditions. This isn't a solo flight where you can make your own decisions about acceptable risk." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. The mission they were discussing was a training exercise designed to simulate a precision strike on a defended target, the kind of operation that required absolute trust between pilots and flawless execution under pressure. It was also the kind of mission that could make or break a pilot's reputation, especially for someone who was still fighting for acceptance in a community that wasn't always welcoming to outsiders. "I've flown this profile 16 times, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. "Perfect scores on the last 8 runs, including 2 in weather conditions worse than what we're facing today." "Solo runs," Morrison countered. "This is different. This is about teamwork, about trust, about knowing that your wingman isn't going to make a decision that puts the entire formation at risk." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that went beyond the immediate discussion of weather and mission parameters. Sarah understood what Morrison was really saying. He didn't trust her judgment. He didn't trust her decision-making under pressure, and he didn't want to risk his own reputation by flying alongside someone he considered unpredictable. Master Sergeant Elena Kozlov emerged from the operations center, her gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and her weathered face bearing the kind of expression that suggested she had been dealing with pilot egos for longer than she cared to remember. Elena had been at Nellis for 15 years, had seen pilots come and go, had watched careers rise and fall based on moments exactly like this one. "Storm's accelerating," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose job it was to keep pilots alive. "We've got a narrow window if this mission is going to happen at all. A decision needs to be made now." Sarah looked around the hangar, taking in the faces of the people who had become her extended family over the past 18 months. There was Rodriguez, still kneeling by the landing gear, but obviously listening to every word. There was Anna, her arms crossed and her expression protective. There were a dozen other maintainers, technicians, and support staff who had worked with her, who knew her capabilities, who had seen her handle aircraft in situations that would have challenged pilots with twice her experience. And there was Morrison, standing with his arms crossed and his expression set in the kind of stubborn certainty that brooked no argument. Behind him, he could see the dark line of the storm growing larger, more menacing, the kind of weather system that would ground flights for the rest of the day if they didn't take off in the next few minutes. "I'm not flying with her in these conditions," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the finality of a command decision. "Not today, not in this weather, not when visibility is going to be measured in feet instead of miles." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration, the sense that no matter how well she performed, how many successful missions she completed, there would always be another test, another moment when her competence was questioned based on factors that had nothing to do with her ability to fly. She walked toward her aircraft, her boots echoing against the concrete floor of the hangar. The F-16 sat waiting, its sleek rinds and predatory stance a testament to decades of aeronautical engineering. The aircraft didn't care about her gender, her background, or the politics of squadron dynamics. It responded only to skill, to confidence, to the kind of partnership between pilot and machine that transcended everything else. As she approached the aircraft, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. There was a small envelope tucked into the side pocket of her flight gear, something that hadn't been there during her pre-flight inspection. She pulled it out, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was from her father, a letter that had been forwarded through military channels and had finally caught up with her here in Nevada. The letter was brief, written in the careful script that she remembered from birthday cards and graduation congratulations. Her father had been a pilot too, flying cargo planes for a commercial airline, and his words carried the weight of understanding that came from someone who had spent his life in the cockpit. "Sarah," the letter began, "I know you're facing challenges that I never had to deal with. The sky doesn't see gender, doesn't care about politics or prejudice. It only responds to skill, determination, and the courage to make the right decision when everything else is uncertain. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember that sometimes the most important flights are the ones that no one thinks you should take." Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her pocket. The words resonated with something deep in her chest, a reminder of why she had chosen this path despite all the obstacles and opposition she had faced along the way. The storm was closer now, close enough that she could feel the first drops of rain hitting the hangar floor near the open doors. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the rumble of thunder was becoming more frequent, more insistent. In a few minutes, the weather would make the decision for all of them, grounding the entire squadron until the system passed. Morrison was still watching her, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating the kind of certainty that came from never having his judgment questioned. Behind him, the other members of the squadron were going about their business, but Sarah could sense the undercurrent of attention, the awareness that something significant was happening. What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah had been monitoring the weather data more carefully than anyone else. She had access to satellite imagery, barometric pressure readings, and wind speed measurements that painted a more complex picture than the simple forecast that had been briefed to the squadron. The storm was moving fast, but it had a structure, a pattern that could be navigated by someone who understood how weather systems behaved over desert terrain. More importantly, Sarah had something that Morrison didn't: a deep, instinctive understanding of how her aircraft would behave in challenging conditions. She had spent countless hours in simulators, in training flights, in real-world missions that had taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated how a fighter jet would respond to wind, rain, and reduced visibility. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone in the hangar, was whether Sarah would back down from the challenge or find a way to prove that Morrison's concerns were unfounded. It was a question that went beyond this single mission, beyond this single day, to the heart of what it meant to be a pilot in a community that wasn't always ready to accept change. As Sarah stood beside her aircraft, feeling the first drops of rain hit her face, she made a decision that would change everything. Sarah's hand traced along the familiar contours of her aircraft's fuselage, the metal still warm from sitting in the desert sun despite the approaching storm. This daily ritual had become as essential to her as breathing, the tactile connection between pilot and machine that spoke of countless hours spent understanding every nuance of how this particular F-16 responded to her touch on the controls. The aircraft bore her initials just below the canopy rail, SMC, though the middle initial honored her grandmother, a woman who had fled China in 1949 and rebuilt her life in California with nothing but determination and an unshakable belief that America would offer opportunities that her homeland could not. Her grandmother's influence permeated every aspect of Sarah's approach to military life. The old woman had taught her that perseverance wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding ways to excel despite obstacles that others might consider insurmountable. "They will tell you that you don't belong," her grandmother had said during her final visit before leaving for flight school. "But belonging is not something they can give you or take away. It is something you create through your actions, through your excellence, through your refusal to accept limitations that have nothing to do with your capabilities." The memory of those words provided comfort now as Sarah completed her walk-around inspection,
checking fluid levels and control surfaces with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her during thousands of hours of training. Each step of the inspection was performed exactly as she had been taught, but with small personal additions that reflected her perfectionist nature. An extra moment spent examining rivet lines for signs of stress, a second check of tire pressure that went beyond regulation requirements, a careful inspection of sensor arrays that most pilots took for granted. Morrison watched her from across the hangar, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting skepticism about her methodical approach. To him, her attention to detail probably seemed like excessive caution, the kind of over-preparation that indicated a lack of confidence rather than professional competence. What he couldn't understand was that Sarah's meticulous approach came not from insecurity, but from a deep understanding that she couldn't afford to make the same mistakes that might be overlooked in other pilots. The double standard wasn't something she had discovered recently. It had been a constant companion throughout her military career. During flight school, her instructors had praised her technical knowledge while questioning her aggressiveness in combat scenarios. During her first squadron assignment, her perfect safety record had been dismissed as evidence that she wasn't pushing hard enough, wasn't taking the kinds of risks that separated great pilots from merely competent ones. Every achievement had been qualified, every success measured against different standards than those applied to her male counterparts. But Sarah had learned to navigate these contradictions with the kind of strategic thinking that her father had taught her during their long conversations about aviation. Her father, David Chen, had spent 25 years flying for Delta Airlines, working his way up from regional routes to international flights through a combination of technical excellence and political awareness. He had taught Sarah that being a pilot wasn't just about stick and rudder skills. It was about understanding people, reading situations, and knowing when to push and when to yield. The airplane doesn't care about politics, he had told her during one of their weekend flights in the Cessna 172 he kept at a small airport outside Sacramento. But the people who decide which airplanes you get to fly, they care about all sorts of things that have nothing to do with your ability to fly. You need to be twice as good to get half the recognition, and you need to be smart enough to pick your battles. The wisdom of his words had proven accurate throughout her career, but it had also created a constant tension between her desire to prove herself and her need to maintain the kind of professional relationships that were essential for advancement in the military. Every flight was simultaneously an opportunity to demonstrate competence and a potential trap that could reinforce negative stereotypes if anything went wrong. Lieutenant Ana Vasquez approached with a clipboard full of maintenance reports, her expression serious but supportive. Ana had become more than just a colleague over the past 18 months. She had become a friend, one of the few people on the base who understood the unique pressures that Sarah faced as one of only 3 female pilots in the squadron. "All your systems are green," Ana said, handing over the maintenance log. "But I want to talk to you about something before you make your final decision about this flight." Sarah looked up from her inspection, recognizing the tone that Ana used when she had something important to say. Ana was known for her directness, her willingness to speak truth to power regardless of rank or politics. It was a quality that had earned her respect throughout the squadron, but it also meant that when Ana had concerns, they were worth hearing. "Morrison has been talking to some of the other pilots," Ana said, lowering her voice to ensure privacy despite the noise of the hangar. "He's been saying that you're too focused on proving yourself, that you're willing to take unnecessary risks because you can't accept that sometimes the smart decision is to walk away from a challenging situation." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they revealed the extent to which Morrison's opinion was influencing others in the squadron. She had worked hard to build relationships with her fellow pilots, had gone out of her way to be supportive and collaborative, had never complained about assignments or expressed frustration with the constant scrutiny of her performance. "What do you think?" Sarah asked. genuinely curious about Anna's perspective. Anna had worked with dozens of pilots over her career, had seen how different personalities responded to pressure and challenge.
"I think Morrison's afraid," Aina replied without hesitation. "I think he's afraid that you're going to make him look bad, that you're going to succeed in situations where he might fail, and that's threatening to someone who's built his reputation on being the squadron's most reliable pilot." The assessment was harsh, but probably accurate. Morrison had been at Nellis for 4 years, had established himself as someone who could be counted on for consistent performance in routine situations. But Sarah had noticed that he rarely volunteered for the most challenging assignments, rarely pushed the boundaries of what was considered standard operating procedure. He was competent and reliable, but he wasn't innovative or particularly courageous. "The weather situation isn't as straightforward as he's making it sound," Aina continued. "I've been monitoring the same data feeds that you have, and there's definitely a window of opportunity if someone has the skills to take advantage of it. The question is whether you want to give Morrison ammunition by succeeding when he predicted failure, or whether you want to avoid conflict by accepting his assessment." It was a strategic calculation that went to the heart of military politics. Sarah could demonstrate her capabilities by completing the mission successfully, but doing so would inevitably create resentment and potentially more opposition in the future. Alternatively, she could defer to Morrison's judgment and maintain squadron harmony, but at the cost of reinforcing the perception that she was willing to back down from challenges when pressed. Master Sergeant Elena Kozlov joined their conversation, her approach signaling that the weather window was closing rapidly. Elena had been watching the developing storm system with the kind of professional concern that came from years of experience with desert weather patterns. "If you're going to fly, it needs to be in the next 10 minutes, Elena said bluntly. "After that, visibility is going to drop below minimums and stay there for at least 3 hours. Sarah looked toward the hangar doors where she could see the leading edge of the storm system now visible as a dark wall of clouds and precipitation. The wind had picked up noticeably, creating small dust devils in the open areas between buildings and causing loose papers and debris to skitter across the flight line. The weather radar showed a complex system with embedded thunderstorms, areas of heavy precipitation, and wind shear that would challenge even experienced pilots. But Sarah could also see gaps in the storm structure, corridors of relatively clear air that could be navigated by someone with the right combination of skill and technology. Her aircraft was equipped with the latest weather radar systems, advanced navigation equipment, and fly-by-wire controls that could compensate for turbulence and reduced visibility. More importantly, Sarah had spent considerable time studying weather flying techniques, had practiced instrument approaches in conditions that many pilots would consider marginal, and had developed an intuitive understanding of how her aircraft would respond to the challenges posed by the approaching storm. The decision came down to a fundamental question about risk assessment and personal integrity. Sarah knew that she could complete the mission safely, knew that her skills and equipment were adequate for the conditions they were facing. The question was whether she was willing to challenge Morrison's authority publicly, whether she was prepared for the political consequences of proving him wrong. Morrison approached their group, his expression suggesting that he had made his own calculations about the situation. "Chen, I'm ordering you to scrub this flight," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "Weather's below minimums, and I won't have you risking government property and squadron reputation on some kind of proving flight." The word ordering hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison didn't actually have command authority over Sarah. They were both captains with equivalent rank, but he was invoking the kind of informal hierarchy that often governed squadron operations. He was betting that Sarah would defer to his seniority and experience rather than challenge him directly. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever her competence was questioned, but she also felt something else. A calm certainty that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. She had spent years preparing for moments like this, had endured countless hours of additional training and study to ensure that she could perform at the highest levels under any conditions. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah replied, her voice level but firm.
but I'm confident in my ability to complete this mission safely. The weather window exists, the aircraft is fully operational, and the mission profile is well within my capabilities." Morrison's expression hardened, and Sarah could see him calculating his next move. He had committed himself publicly to the position that the flight was too dangerous, and Sarah's refusal to accept his judgment represented a direct challenge to his credibility. "Then you'll be flying alone," Morrison said finally, "because I won't be responsible for following you into conditions that any reasonable pilot would consider unacceptable." The gauntlet had been thrown down, and Sarah realized that there was no middle ground remaining. Either she would back down and accept Morrison's assessment, reinforcing his authority and her supposed recklessness, or she would complete the mission solo and prove that his concerns were unfounded. As she stood in the hangar, surrounded by colleagues who were watching to see how this confrontation would resolve itself, Sarah thought about all the pilots who had come before her, all the women who had fought for the opportunity to serve in combat roles, to fly the most advanced aircraft in the world, to prove that competence had nothing to do with gender or background. She thought about her grandmother, who had rebuilt her life in a foreign country with nothing but determination and an unshakable belief in the possibility of success. She thought about her father, whose quiet wisdom had taught her that being a pilot meant making difficult decisions based on technical knowledge rather than political considerations. Most of all, she thought about the aircraft waiting behind her, the machine that had become an extension of her will and capabilities, the partnership that had been forged through countless hours of training and preparation. The storm was almost upon them now, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this particular mission, but the trajectory of her entire career. Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit as the first heavy raindrops began hammering against the aircraft's canopy, each impact creating small explosions of water that distorted her view of the flight line. The familiar ritual of pre-flight checks took on added significance in the deteriorating weather conditions. Every switch, every gauge, every system parameter had to be perfect because there would be no margin for error once she was airborne. The radio crackled to life as she completed her engine start procedures, the voice of the tower controller cutting through the static with professional concern. Devil 27, tower. We're showing wind gusts to 35 knots with embedded thunderstorms moving through the departure corridor. Advise your intentions. Sarah keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Tower, Devil 27 is ready for departure. Request immediate takeoff clearance to avoid weather deterioration. There was a pause that lasted long enough for Sarah to wonder if the controller was going to deny her request. Through the increasingly heavy rain, she could see Morrison standing in the hangar doorway, his arms crossed and his expression suggesting that he was waiting for her to abort the mission. Other squadron members had gathered around him, creating an impromptu audience for what was becoming a very public test of judgment and capability. Devil 27, cleared for immediate takeoff. Fly runway heading, contact departure on 124.3. Good luck out there. The controller's final words carry a weight of personal concern that went beyond standard radio protocol. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began her taxi toward the active runway, the aircraft's wheels splashing through puddles that were forming faster than the drainage systems could handle them. As she reached the runway threshold, Sarah took a moment to assess the conditions one final time. Visibility was dropping rapidly, with the far end of the runway barely visible through the sheets of rain that were now falling steadily. The wind was gusting unpredictably, causing the aircraft to rock slightly on its landing gear despite the brakes being set. But Sarah's weather radar showed what her eyes couldn't see: the structure of the storm system, the corridors of relatively clear air that existed between the heaviest precipitation cells, the opportunities for safe passage that required precise navigation and timing to exploit. This was the kind of flying that separated good pilots from great ones, the kind of challenge that demanded the full integration of technical knowledge, situational awareness, and pure flying skill. She advanced the throttle and felt the familiar surge of power as the F-16's engine responded to her input. The aircraft accelerated down the rain-soaked runway with the aggressive urgency that made fighter jets fundamentally different from any other type of aircraft. Within seconds, she was airborne, climbing into the gray wall of clouds that had seemed so forbidding from the ground. The transition from visual to instrument flight was instantaneous and complete.
One moment, Sarah could see the lights of the airfield receding below her, and the next, she was enclosed in a gray cocoon of cloud and rain that reduced her world to the green glow of her instrument panel. This was flying in its purest form, a partnership between pilot and machine that relied on trust, training, and the kind of spatial awareness that could only be developed through years of experience. Her weather radar painted a complex picture of the storm system, showing areas of heavy precipitation in red and yellow, corridors of lighter activity in green, and the clear air beyond in black. Sarah began threading her way through the system with the precision of a seamstress, making small course corrections to avoid the heaviest weather while maintaining her planned route toward the training area. Devil 27, departure control, we're showing you deviating from the assigned heading. State your intentions. Sarah smiled grimly as she keyed her microphone. The air traffic controller couldn't see what she was seeing on her weather radar, couldn't understand the three-dimensional chess game she was playing with the storm system. Departure, Devil 27 is deviating from the weather, returning to the course when able. What the controller also couldn't see was that Sarah's navigation through the storm was bringing her closer to the training target than the original flight plan would have allowed. By using the weather system's structure to her advantage, she was actually improving her mission profile while demonstrating the kind of adaptability that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. The turbulence increased as she penetrated deeper into the storm system, the aircraft bucking and rolling despite the fly-by-wire flight controls' attempts to smooth out the roughest impact. Sarah felt herself pressed against her restraints as the fighter rode the invisible roller coaster of wind shear and thermal activity, but she maintained precise control of heading and altitude through small, steady inputs on the stick and rudder pedals. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah emerged from the worst of the weather into a corridor of relatively clear air that her weather radar had predicted would be there. The visibility improved dramatically, revealing the rugged desert landscape below and the target complex that was her destination. She had not only navigated through the storm successfully, but had done so while maintaining her planned schedule and arriving in position to complete the training mission as briefed. The target area was a mock-up of a defended installation, complete with simulated anti-aircraft positions and electronic warfare systems that would test her ability to deliver ordnance accurately while avoiding simulated threats. She began her attack approach, diving toward the target with the kind of aggressive precision that the F-16 was designed to execute. But as she pulled out of her attack run, having delivered her simulated weapons with textbook accuracy, Sarah noticed something on her radar that made her blood run cold. Another aircraft was approaching the training area from the east, flying erratically and broadcasting an emergency transponder code. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday! This is Falcon 16 declaring an emergency. Multiple systems failures, limited control authority, requesting immediate assistance." Sarah recognized the voice immediately. It was Morrison. Somehow he had taken off after her, perhaps intending to prove that the weather conditions were manageable, or perhaps driven by some combination of pride and concern that had overridden his earlier caution. But something had gone wrong, badly wrong, and now he was in serious trouble.
Falcon 16, this is Devil 27. I'm in the training area and can provide assistance. What's your status? Morrison's voice, when he replied, carried a tone that Sarah had never heard from him before. Fear, barely controlled panic, and the kind of desperate hope that came from facing a situation that was beyond his ability to handle alone. Devil 27, Sarah, I've lost hydraulic pressure, flight controls are barely responsive, and my instruments are showing failures across multiple systems. I can barely maintain level flight. The use of her first name was significant, a breach of radio protocol that indicated just how desperate Morrison's situation had become. Sarah immediately began plotting an intercept course, her mind shifting from the training mission to a real-world emergency that demanded all of her skills and experience. Falcon 16, maintain current heading and altitude if possible. I'm approaching from your 6 o'clock position and will provide navigation assistance back to base. As Sarah closed the distance to Morrison's aircraft, she could see the extent of the emergency. His F-16 was flying with visible damage, scorch marks along the fuselage suggesting some kind of electrical fire, and control surfaces that were moving erratically as he fought to maintain control. The aircraft was also trailing a thin stream of hydraulic fluid, a sight that made Sarah's stomach clench with professional concern. "What happened up there?" Sarah asked, positioning her aircraft alongside Morrison's so she could provide visual reference for navigation. "Hit severe turbulence about 10 miles out, lost control for about 30 seconds, pulled some serious G's trying to recover. When I got the aircraft stable again, half my systems were dark and the hydraulics were failing." I understood immediately what had occurred. Morrison had encountered the same weather system that she had navigated successfully, but without the careful route planning and weather radar interpretation that had allowed her to avoid the worst of turbulence. He had tried to punch through the storm system by brute force, rather than finesse, and his aircraft had paid the price. "Can you see the base from your position?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The weather system was still active between their current position and Nellis, creating a wall of clouds and precipitation that blocked visual navigation. "Negative. I'm flying on instruments, but half of them are giving me conflicting information. I don't think I can find the field on my own." The admission was painful for Morrison to make. Sarah could hear it in his voice. This was a pilot who prided himself on competence and self-reliance, who had built his reputation on being someone who could handle any situation. But now he was completely dependent on Sarah's assistance for his survival. "Roger, Falcon 1-6. I'll provide navigation guidance back to base. Follow my instructions exactly and don't try to anticipate my commands." Sarah began leading Morrison through the same weather system that she had navigated earlier, but now the challenge was exponentially more difficult. She had to find a route that would accommodate an aircraft with severely limited control authority, while providing precise navigation instructions to a pilot who was fighting just to keep his damaged fighter in the air. The return flight became a masterclass in precision flying and crew resource management. Sarah had to constantly monitor Morrison's position relative to her own aircraft, while simultaneously navigating through the weather system and coordinating with air traffic control to clear a direct route back to the base. Every few minutes, Morrison's voice would crack slightly as he reported another system failure or control difficulty, but Sarah's responses remained calm and professional, providing the steady guidance that was keeping both of them alive. "Devil 27, you're doing great," Morrison said during one of their brief communication exchanges. "I don't think I could have found my way through this weather on my own."
The admission was significant, a public acknowledgement that Sarah's skills and decision-making had proven superior to his own. But more importantly, it was a recognition that her willingness to fly in conditions he had deemed unacceptable had positioned her to provide the assistance that was now saving his life. As they approached Nellis Air Force Base, the weather conditions were deteriorating further. The rain was falling harder, visibility was dropping below minimums, and the wind was gusting unpredictably across the runway. Normal procedures would have called for a diversion to an alternate airfield with better weather, but Morrison's fuel state and system failures made that impossible. "Tower, this is Devil 27 leading Falcon 1-6 on emergency approach. Falcon 1-6 has multiple system failures and limited control authority. Request priority handling and emergency equipment." The tower controller's response was immediate and professional. "Devil 27 cleared for emergency approach runway 21. Crash and rescue equipment is rolling. The weather is below minimums, but we'll keep the runway lights at maximum intensity." Sarah began the most challenging approach of her career, leading a damaged aircraft through weather conditions that would have tested even a fully functional fighter jet. She had to provide precise navigation guidance while simultaneously monitoring her own aircraft's position and energy state, all while preparing for the possibility that Morrison might lose control completely during the final approach. "Falcon 1-6, we're 5 miles from touchdown. Maintain current airspeed and follow my lead exactly. Don't try to make any corrections unless I tell you."
Morrison's aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control as they descended through the clouds toward the runway. She could see him fighting the controls, making constant small corrections to maintain formation with her aircraft. The damaged F-16 was responding sluggishly to his inputs, and she knew that the margin for error was becoming smaller with every passing second. At 2 miles from touchdown, Morrison's aircraft suddenly lurched to the left, departing controlled flight as his damaged flight control system finally failed completely. Sarah watched in horror as his F-16 entered an uncontrolled descent, spinning toward the ground with Morrison trapped inside. "Falcon 1-6, you're in an uncontrolled descent. Eject, eject, eject!" But Morrison's voice came back over the radio with desperate determination. "Negative, negative. I think I can regain control. Systems are coming back online." It was a lie born of hope and desperation. Sarah could see that Morrison's aircraft was beyond recovery, but she also understood his reluctance to eject. An ejection in these weather conditions, at low altitude and high speed, would be almost as dangerous as riding the aircraft into the ground. That's when Sarah made a decision that would define her entire career. Instead of maintaining her own safe approach to the runway, she rolled her aircraft into a steep diving turn, positioning herself directly beneath Morrison's spinning fighter. "Falcon 1-6, I'm gonna try something. When I tell you, pull back on the stick as hard as you can and hold it there." Sarah's plan was audacious and dangerous. She intended to use her aircraft's wake turbulence and jet wash to help stabilize Morrison's spinning fighter, essentially flying formation with an out-of-control aircraft in zero visibility conditions. It was a maneuver that had never been attempted in actual emergency conditions, something that existed only in theoretical discussions and computer simulations. She positioned her F-16 directly below Morrison's aircraft, flying inverted to create the maximum aerodynamic interaction between the two fighters. The turbulence from her jet engines and wing surfaces created a pocket of disturbed air that began to affect Morrison's spin rate, gradually damping the uncontrolled rotation. "Now, Morrison, pull back now!"
Morrison's aircraft responded sluggishly to the combination of his control inputs and the aerodynamic forces generated by Sarah's positioning. The spin rate decreased, then stopped, and finally, the damaged fighter began to assume something resembling controlled flight. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't stable, but it was survivable. "Holy shit, Sarah, it's working! I've got partial control back." Sarah maintained her inverted position beneath Morrison's aircraft, essentially flying both fighters through the final approach phase. She had to monitor her own altitude and airspeed while simultaneously providing the aerodynamic assistance that was keeping Morrison's damaged F-16 in the air. The concentration required was exhausting, demanding every bit of her skill and experience. "Tower, Devil 2-7, we're both committed to landing. Falcon 1-6 has partial control authority with assistance from my aircraft. Emergency equipment needs to be positioned for a possible hard landing." The tower controller's voice carried a note of amazement that broke through his professional composure. "Roger, Devil 2-7. Crash and rescue is standing by. You're cleared to land any runway, any direction." The final seconds of the approach were a blur of precise flying and split-second timing. Sarah had to roll her aircraft upright and move away from Morrison's fighter at exactly the right moment, giving him enough space to attempt his landing while ensuring that her own approach remained viable. Morrison's landing was rough but survivable. His damaged aircraft bounced twice before settling onto the runway and rolling to a stop surrounded by emergency vehicles. Sarah's own touchdown was textbook perfect, a smooth arrival that belied the complexity of the maneuver she had just completed. As both aircraft came to a stop on the rain-soaked runway, Sarah felt the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by the quiet satisfaction that came from successfully completing an impossible mission. She had not only navigated
through weather conditions that Morrison had deemed unacceptable, but had used her position to save his life when his own judgment had put him in mortal danger. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, and for the first time since she had known him, he sounded genuinely humble. "Devil 27, Sarah, I owe you my life. That was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen." But even as Sarah accepted the acknowledgement, she knew that the real test would come later, when the adrenaline faded and the squadron had to grapple with the implications of what had just occurred. Morrison's authority had been challenged not through politics or argument, but through demonstrated competence under pressure. The question now was whether the squadron would learn from this experience or find ways to minimize its significance. As she shut down her aircraft systems in the storm-darkened hangar, surrounded by maintenance crews and fellow pilots who had witnessed the entire sequence of events, Sarah realized that this flight had changed everything. The dynamics of the squadron, her relationship with Morrison, and her own position within the military aviation community had all been fundamentally altered by the events of the past 2 hours. The storm was beginning to pass, but Sarah understood that the real weather, the complex dynamics of military culture, gender politics, and professional recognition would take much longer to clear. Master Sergeant Kozlov approached her aircraft as Sarah completed her post-flight inspection, her weathered face showing a mixture of professional admiration and personal concern. "Captain Chen, that was either the finest piece of flying I've seen in 15 years or the most reckless thing anyone's ever attempted at this base." Sarah looked up from her logbook, recognizing the sergeant's conflicted assessment. "What do you think it was, Sergeant?"
"I think it was both," Kozlov replied honestly. "And I think that's what's going to make the debrief very interesting." The hangar was buzzing with activity as word of the emergency spread throughout the base. Pilots from other squadrons were arriving to hear first-hand accounts of the rescue, while maintenance crews examined Morrison's damaged aircraft to understand the extent of the system failures that had nearly killed him. Lieutenant Anna Vasquez appeared at Sarah's side, her expression mixing relief with professional curiosity. "The preliminary damage assessment on Morrison's bird shows hydraulic failure, electrical fire damage, and flight control computer malfunctions," she reported. "It's amazing he was able to maintain any control at all." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Morrison's aircraft had suffered the kind of catastrophic system failures that were every pilot's nightmare, multiple, cascading problems that overwhelmed normal emergency procedures. Under normal circumstances, ejection would have been the only reasonable option. "What caused the initial failures?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Looks like severe turbulence overstressed the hydraulic lines, which led to fluid loss and pump cavitation. The electrical fire probably started when he pulled high Gs trying to recover from the upset. Damaged wiring arced and took out the flight control computers." It was exactly what Sarah had suspected. Morrison had encountered the same weather system that she had navigated successfully, but his approach had been to muscle through the turbulence rather than work around it. The result had been structural damage that cascaded into multiple system failures, turning a manageable weather challenge into a life-threatening emergency. Captain Morrison appeared in the hangar doorway, his flight suit stained with sweat and his face showing the strain of the past hour. He walked directly toward Sarah, his expression serious but no longer hostile. The antagonism that had characterized their relationship for the past 18 months seemed to have evaporated, replaced with something that might have been respect. "Sarah," he said, using her first name in a public setting for the first time, "I need to talk to you." They stepped away from the crowd of maintainers and pilots, finding a quiet corner of the hangar where they could speak privately. Morrison's posture had changed.
Gone was the swagger and certainty that had defined his leadership style, replaced with the humility that came from surviving an experience that had challenged every assumption he held about flying and competence. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About the weather, about your judgment, about your capabilities. If you hadn't been up there—" He paused, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or political calculation, but what she saw was genuine recognition of her abilities, tempered by the kind of professional respect that could only be earned through demonstrated performance under pressure. "The weather was manageable," Sarah replied carefully. "It required precise navigation and advanced planning, but it was within acceptable limits for properly equipped aircraft." Morrison nodded slowly. "I didn't understand that. I saw the storm system and made assumptions based on worst-case scenarios rather than actual conditions. You saw opportunities where I only saw risks." The admission was significant, not just for their personal relationship, but for the broader dynamics of the squadron. Morrison's public acknowledgement of Sarah's superior judgment would inevitably influence how other pilots viewed her capabilities and decision-making. "There's going to be an investigation," Morrison continued. "Anytime there's an aircraft emergency, especially one involving system failures and unconventional rescue procedures, the Air Force wants to understand exactly what happened and why." Sarah had expected this. Military aviation operated on the principle that every incident, successful or otherwise, contained lessons that could improve safety and effectiveness for future operations. The investigation would examine every aspect of the day's events, from the initial weather briefing to the final landing procedures.
"I'll cooperate fully with any investigation," Sarah said. "The data from both aircraft should provide a complete picture of what occurred." Morrison's expression suggested that he was struggling with something beyond the immediate circumstances of the emergency. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer." She waited, recognizing the tone of someone who was about to ask a question that required courage to voice. "How long have you been capable of flying like that? How long have you been able to handle conditions and situations that I've been telling people were beyond your abilities?" The question went to the heart of everything that had been wrong with their professional relationship. Morrison was asking whether his assessment of her capabilities had ever been accurate, or whether his judgment had been compromised by biases and assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual performance. "I've been ready for these kinds of challenges since I arrived at Nellis," Sarah replied honestly. "My training, my experience, and my technical knowledge have always been adequate for the missions we fly here. The question was never about my capabilities. It was about whether I would be given opportunities to demonstrate them." Morrison absorbed this information with the kind of uncomfortable recognition that came from realizing that his actions had been based on false premises. "I've been holding you back," he said finally. "Not just from challenging missions, but from the kind of leadership roles that your skills merit." It was more than an apology. It was an acknowledgement that the squadron's informal power structure had been denying opportunities to someone based on factors unrelated to professional competence. The implications extended beyond Sarah's individual situation to questions about how talent was recognized and developed throughout the military aviation community. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how Morrison intended to process this new understanding of squadron dynamics. "Now we figure out how to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Not just the emergency situation, but the broader pattern of underestimating capabilities based on assumptions rather than evidence." As they rejoined the larger group in the hangar, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere had changed subtly but significantly. The other pilots were looking at her differently, not with the mixture of skepticism and tolerance that had characterized their previous interactions, but with the kind of professional respect that was normally reserved for the squadron's most experienced and capable members. The transformation wasn't complete,
and Sarah understood that changing deeply held attitudes would take time and continued demonstration of competence. But something fundamental had shifted during the 2 hours she had spent navigating through the storm and guiding Morrison's damaged aircraft home. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached with a message from the squadron commander. "Colonel Williams wants to see both of you in his office as soon as you're finished with post-flight procedures." Sarah nodded, understanding that the real reckoning was just beginning. The flight ended successfully, but now came the more complex challenge of explaining her decisions to senior leadership and dealing with the institutional implications of what had occurred. As she gathered her flight gear and prepared for what would undoubtedly be a lengthy debrief, Sarah reflected on the day's events and their broader significance. She had proven her capabilities under the most demanding circumstances possible, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that competence and courage could overcome the barriers created by prejudice and assumption. The storm outside was clearing, but Sarah knew that the real change would take much longer to achieve.
Colonel Patricia Williams stood behind her desk as Sarah and Morrison entered her office, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of the day's events. The walls of her office told the story of a distinguished career, photographs of various aircraft she had flown, commendations from 3 decades of service, and a display case containing medals that spoke of combat experience and leadership under pressure. Williams had been one of the first women to fly combat missions in the Air Force, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for pilots who let politics interfere with mission effectiveness. "Sit down, both of you," Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in environments far more challenging than a squadron debrief. "I've been monitoring the radio traffic from this afternoon's flights, and I received preliminary reports from air traffic control, weather services, and maintenance. What I want now is your first-hand account of what happened up there." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing that this conversation would require him to admit errors in judgment that went beyond simple weather assessment. "Ma'am, I made several critical mistakes today. I questioned Captain Chen's decision to fly in marginal weather conditions, then took off in deteriorating conditions without proper preparation or planning." Williams nodded, her expression suggesting that she had expected this admission. "Continue. My aircraft suffered multiple system failures when I encountered severe turbulence that I should have anticipated and avoided. Without Captain Chen's assistance, I would have lost the aircraft and possibly my life." The colonel turned her attention to Sarah, her gaze direct, but not hostile. "Captain Chen, walk me through your decision-making process, from the initial weather briefing through the emergency recovery." Sarah took a deep breath, understanding that this debrief would establish the official record of events and potentially influence her career trajectory for years to come. "Ma'am, my analysis of the weather data indicated that while conditions were challenging, they remained within acceptable parameters for properly equipped aircraft with experienced pilots. The storm system had structure and predictability that could be exploited through careful navigation and timing." She pulled out her flight notes and weather analysis documents that she had prepared meticulously before takeoff. "I identified corridors of reduced precipitation and turbulence that would allow safe passage to the training area. My aircraft's weather radar and navigation systems were ideally suited for this type of operation." Williams examined the weather analysis with the attention of someone who understood the technical complexities involved. "This is very thorough work, Captain. How long did this analysis take you?" "I began monitoring the weather system approximately 6 hours before our scheduled takeoff time, ma'am. I updated my analysis every hour as new data became available." Morrison's head turned sharply at this revelation. He had made his assessment of the weather based on a standard briefing that was already 2 hours old by the time they had reached the hangar. Sarah had been working with real-time data and sophisticated analysis, while he had been relying on generalized forecasts. "And the emergency recovery?" Williams prompted. Sarah described the rescue operation in precise technical terms, explaining her decision to use wake turbulence and aerodynamic interference to stabilize Morrison's spinning aircraft. She outlined the risks and benefits of the maneuver, the alternatives she considered, and the factors that had led her to attempt such an unconventional approach. "Ma'am, the physics of the situation suggested that controlled wake turbulence could potentially dampen the uncontrolled rotation. I had studied similar scenarios in advanced flight training, though obviously this was the first time the technique had been attempted in actual emergency conditions." William's expression showed something that might have been an impressive surprise. "Where did you encounter training in wake turbulence manipulation for emergency situations?" "Test pilot school, ma'am. I completed the program 2 years ago as part of my professional development track. The curriculum included advanced aerodynamics and unconventional flight envelope exploration."
Morrison stared at Sarah with an expression of dawning realization. Test pilot school was among the most prestigious and technically demanding programs in military aviation, accepting only the most exceptional pilots for training in experimental flight techniques and aircraft development. Sarah had qualifications and experience that he had been completely unaware of. "Why wasn't this background reflected in your squadron assignment briefings?" Williams asked, her tone suggesting that someone had failed to properly communicate Sarah's qualifications. "I requested that my test pilot school completion not be emphasized in my personnel file, ma'am. I wanted to be evaluated based on my performance in routine squadron operations rather than specialized training that might set different expectations." The answer revealed something important about Sarah's approach to her military career. Rather than leveraging her exceptional qualifications for preferential treatment, she had chosen to prove herself through daily performance and gradual demonstration of competence. It was a strategy that had backfired in the short term, but had ultimately positioned her to provide assistance when it was most needed. Williams turned her attention back to Morrison. "Captain Morrison, how do you assess Captain Chen's performance during today's events?" Morrison's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "Ma'am, Captain Chen demonstrated superior weather analysis, exceptional navigation skills, and innovative problem-solving under pressure. Her decision-making throughout the entire sequence of events was flawless. Without her assistance, I would not have survived today's flight." The admission was public, official, and unequivocal. Morrison was acknowledging not only Sarah's technical competence, but her superiority in the specific areas where he had questioned her judgment. Williams made notes in Sarah's personal file, documentation that would become part of her permanent military record. "Captain Chen," Williams continued, "your actions today raise questions about how this squadron has been utilizing your capabilities. Based on what I'm hearing, you've been underemployed relative to your qualifications and experience." Sarah chose her words carefully, understanding that this was an opportunity to address broader issues without appearing to criticize her superiors. "Ma'am, I believe the squadron has been appropriately cautious in assigning challenging missions to newer members. Today's events demonstrated that I'm ready for increased responsibilities." It was a diplomatic response that acknowledged past limitations while positioning her for future opportunities. Williams seemed to appreciate the careful balance between assertiveness and professionalism. "The investigation into today's events will be conducted by Colonel Martinez from the Air Force Safety Center. Both of you will be interviewed extensively, and your aircraft will undergo complete technical analysis. Captain Chen, I want you to know that your actions are being considered for formal recognition." The mention of formal recognition carried significant implications. Military decorations and commendations became permanent parts of personnel records, influencing promotion opportunities and career assignments. More importantly, official recognition would establish Sarah's competence and judgment as matters of documented record rather than subjective opinion. "Ma'am, I'd like to request that my assessment of Captain Chen's performance be included in any formal documentation. She saved my life today, and her flying was the most skilled I've ever witnessed." Williams nodded approvingly. "Your statement will be part of the official record, Captain Morrison. Is there anything else about today's events that either of you believes should be documented?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am,
I believe today's events highlight the importance of thorough weather analysis and individual preparation for challenging
Missions. The squadron might benefit from enhanced training in advanced weather navigation techniques. It was a subtle way of suggesting that Morrison's difficulties had resulted from inadequate preparation rather than insurmountable conditions. Williams understood the implication and made additional notes in her file. Captain Morrison, do you have any additional observations about today's events or their implications for squadron operations? Morrison's response reflected the kind of honest self-assessment that was essential for learning from mistakes. Ma'am, I believe I allowed personal biases to influence my professional judgment regarding Captain Chen's capabilities. This affected not only mission planning, but also resource allocation and opportunity assignment within the squadron. The admission was more significant than it might have appeared. Morrison was acknowledging that his treatment of Sarah had been influenced by factors other than objective assessment of her abilities. Williams documented this statement as well, creating an official record that would influence future personnel decisions. Both of you will be temporarily grounded pending completion of the investigation, Williams announced. This is standard procedure for any incident involving aircraft damage and unconventional recovery procedures. The grounding is not punitive. It's designed to ensure that all safety factors are properly understood before flight operations resume. Sarah accepted the grounding without complaint, understanding that the investigation would ultimately vindicate her decision-making and demonstrate the soundness of her actions. The temporary restriction on flying was a small price to pay for the opportunity to have her competence officially documented and recognized. As the formal debrief concluded, Williams addressed both pilots with the kind of guidance that came from decades of experience navigating military culture and politics. Today's events will have consequences that extend beyond this squadron. Captain Chen, your actions will be studied and analyzed throughout the Air Force. Captain Morrison, your honest assessment of these events reflects the kind of professional integrity that this service values. They were dismissed with instructions to make themselves available for the investigation team and to prepare detailed written statements documenting their actions and decisions. As they left Williams' office, Sarah noticed that Morrison's demeanor had changed fundamentally. Gone was the casual dismissiveness that had characterized their previous interactions, replaced by something approaching professional deference. "Sarah," Morrison said as they walked through the squadron building, "I owe you more than just an apology. I need to make things right, not just between us, but for the entire squadron." Sarah looked at him curiously, wondering what form this commitment might take. "I'm going to recommend you for promotion to flight lead. Your performance today demonstrated leadership capabilities that exceed my own, and the squadron needs to recognize that officially." The offer was significant beyond its immediate implications. Flight leaders were responsible for mission planning, tactical decision-making, and the performance of other pilots. It was a position that required not only technical competence, but also the trust and respect of colleagues. Morrison's recommendation would carry considerable weight with squadron leadership. "I appreciate that, Jake," Sarah replied, using his first name for the first time. "But I want to earn that position through continued performance, not because of a single dramatic event." Morrison nodded, understanding her perspective. "You've already earned it, Sarah. Today just made it impossible for anyone to ignore." As news of the emergency spread throughout the base, Sarah found herself the subject of attention from pilots and support personnel who had previously viewed her as a competent but unremarkable squadron member. The rescue operation had demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal expectations, establishing her as someone whose opinions and judgment deserved serious consideration. Lieutenant Ana Vasquez approached with a smile that reflected both relief and professional satisfaction. "The maintenance analysis of Morrison's aircraft confirms everything you reported. Multiple system failures, cascading problems, and damage patterns consistent with severe turbulence encountered. The investigation team is calling your rescue operation a textbook example of innovative problem-solving under pressure."
"The choice I faced 5 years ago," Elena continued, "was whether to remain silent about the implications of what we had created or to risk my career by speaking out about technologies that existed beyond public awareness or democratic oversight. I chose to walk away from the project,
And for 18 months, I lived with the burden of knowledge I couldn't share and concerns I couldn't express. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of Conference Room 7 Alpha during one of the early Oversight Committee meetings. The image captured the tension and uncertainty of those first months when scientists, military officers, and congressional representatives had struggled to develop frameworks for managing technologies that challenged traditional categories of classification and oversight. But walking away was only the beginning of the story. The real work began when I returned to the Pentagon to advocate for transparency and accountability mechanisms that could allow powerful technologies to be developed responsibly within democratic institutions. Elena's voice carried the conviction of someone who had seen how individual conscience could influence institutional change. What happened next surprised everyone involved. We discovered that transparency and security weren't opposing values, but complementary requirements for maintaining public trust in democratic governance. The audience included several international observers who had come to study the American approach to technology oversight. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Japan's Science and Technology Agency took careful notes on Elena's description of how oversight mechanisms had evolved to address both security requirements and democratic accountability. Similar initiatives were being developed in allied nations facing their own challenges with emerging technologies that crossed traditional boundaries between military and civilian applications. The oversight framework we developed for quantum technologies has now been adapted for artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cybersecurity, and space-based systems, Elena explained, displaying a chart that showed how the Shadowhawk precedent had influenced policy development across multiple government agencies. But more importantly, it has changed how we think about the relationship between scientific discovery and social responsibility. In the audience, Sarah Chen, now Dr. Chen, leading a quantum communication research program at MIT, reflected on how her own understanding of scientific responsibility had evolved during the years since Project Shadowhawk. The oversight requirements that she had initially viewed as bureaucratic obstacles had become integral parts of her research methodology, forcing her team to consider social implications alongside technical feasibility from the earliest stages of their work. Elena advanced to a slide showing recent applications of quantum communication technology that had emerged under the oversight framework, medical emergency networks that could coordinate response efforts across vast distances, environmental monitoring systems that could track climate changes in real time, educational platforms that could connect students in remote areas with teachers and resources anywhere in the world. The technologies we were developing in secret 5 years ago are now being used openly to address some of humanity's most pressing challenges, Elena said. The difference is that they're being developed with appropriate safeguards, public awareness, and democratic input into how they should be applied. But Elena knew that the audience was also aware of the ongoing challenges. The oversight framework had been successful in the United States, but other nations were developing similar technologies without comparable accountability mechanisms. The global nature of quantum communication networks meant that responsible development in one country could be undermined by irresponsible applications elsewhere. The work is far from finished, Elena acknowledged, addressing the international concerns directly. Quantum technologies don't respect national boundaries, and neither can the oversight mechanisms designed to manage them responsibly. The frameworks we've developed domestically must evolve into international agreements that ensure these capabilities serve humanity's common interests rather than narrow national advantages. She clicked a slide showing recent initiatives to develop international quantum technology treaties, efforts that had grown out of the collaborative relationships forged during the original.
This is the remarkable true story of Captain Sarah Chen, a fighter pilot whose single decision to fly through a dangerous storm would transform not only her own career, but the entire landscape of military aviation training and safety procedures. What began as a routine training flight at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada became a defining moment that would influence thousands of pilots for generations to come. Captain Sarah Chen was a highly skilled F-16 pilot stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, but despite her exceptional qualifications, including graduation from the prestigious Air Force Test Pilot School,
she found herself consistently undervalued by her squadron leadership. Her technical expertise and innovative approaches to weather analysis were often dismissed by colleagues who preferred conventional, risk-averse approaches to flight operations. The squadron culture at Nellis reflected broader institutional biases that favored traditional thinking over innovation. Sarah's sophisticated weather analysis techniques and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom made some of her colleagues uncomfortable, particularly Captain Morrison, an experienced pilot who viewed her methods as unnecessarily aggressive and potentially dangerous. Colonel Williams, the squadron commander, had initially been influenced by Morrison's assessments of Sarah's capabilities. This led to Sarah being assigned less challenging missions and excluded from advanced training opportunities, despite her superior technical qualifications and demonstrated competence in complex flight operations. The crisis began on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning when a severe weather system moved across the Nevada desert. The meteorological conditions included severe thunderstorms, dangerous wind shear, and turbulence that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Standard operating procedures called for grounding all aircraft until the storm system passed, a decision that would typically delay training operations for several hours. Captain Morrison had launched for a routine training mission before the full severity of the weather system became apparent. As conditions deteriorated rapidly, Morrison found himself trapped in increasingly dangerous atmospheric conditions with limited fuel and diminishing options for safe recovery. His aircraft was being buffeted by severe turbulence and wind shear that threatened to exceed the F-16 structural limitations. The situation quickly escalated from a routine weather delay to a genuine emergency. Morrison's aircraft was running critically low on fuel, and the storm system showed no signs of abating. Traditional recovery procedures would require him to fly through conditions that appeared to exceed safe operational limits, creating a potentially fatal scenario. While other squadron members accepted that Morrison would have to wait out the storm or risk attempting recovery in dangerous conditions, Sarah Chen saw a different possibility. Her detailed analysis of the weather data revealed patterns and gaps in the storm system that others had missed. She identified a narrow corridor through the turbulence that would allow safe navigation to Morrison's location and successful escort back to base. Sarah's proposal to launch a rescue mission was met with immediate resistance from squadron leadership and fellow pilots. They argued that sending another aircraft into the storm would only create a second emergency without solving the first. Morrison himself initially resisted the rescue attempt, preferring to wait for conditions to improve rather than risk another pilot's safety. Colonel Williams was reluctant to authorize the mission, concerned about the potential consequences of losing a second aircraft and pilot. The weather conditions appeared to be beyond the operational limits of F-16 aircraft, and conventional wisdom suggested that patience was the safest course of action. However, Sarah's persistent advocacy for her analysis and her confidence in her ability to navigate the challenging conditions eventually convinced Williams to authorize the rescue attempt. The decision would prove to be one of the most significant moments in the squadron's history. Sarah's flight through the storm system demonstrated piloting skills and weather analysis capabilities that exceeded anything her colleagues had previously witnessed. She navigated through severe turbulence and wind shear with precision and confidence, using advanced weather radar interpretation techniques that she had developed through years of study and practical application.
Throughout the operation, Sarah maintained calm and professional communication with both Morrison and ground control, providing clear instructions and reassurance during what could have been a panic-inducing situation. Her technical expertise and unflappable demeanor proved crucial in maintaining the confidence necessary for successful completion of the mission. The most challenging aspect of the rescue was the formation flying required to escort Morrison safely back to base. Both aircraft had to maintain precise positioning while navigating through continuing turbulence and wind shear. Sarah's advanced flying techniques allowed her to provide stability reference for Morrison's aircraft during the most difficult portions of the recovery. The successful completion of the rescue mission created immediate and dramatic changes in squadron dynamics. Morrison, who had been Sarah's most vocal critic, was forced to confront the reality that his assessment of her capabilities had been completely incorrect. The pilot whose judgment he had questioned had just saved his life using techniques and knowledge that he didn't possess. Colonel Williams recognized that her previous evaluation of Sarah's abilities had been influenced by unfounded biases and incomplete information. The rescue operation had demonstrated competence and leadership qualities that exceeded those of more senior officers in the squadron. Williams immediately began reassessing personnel evaluations and assignment decisions. The technical aspects of Sarah's weather flying techniques became the subject of intense interest from other pilots and training organizations. Her methods for analyzing complex meteorological data and identifying safe flight paths through dangerous conditions represented innovations that could benefit the entire Air Force. However, the success also created some tension within the squadron as other pilots grappled with the implications of her achievement. Some colleagues felt that their own capabilities had been called into question by comparison to her exceptional performance. The Air Force Safety Center conducted a comprehensive investigation of the rescue operation, led by Colonel Martinez, an experienced investigator who specialized in complex flight operations. The investigation examined every aspect of Sarah's decision-making process, from her initial weather analysis through the execution of the rescue mission. The investigation's findings were unequivocally positive. Colonel Martinez concluded that Sarah's actions were not only appropriate but exemplary, representing the kind of innovative thinking and technical excellence that the Air Force needed to encourage and develop. Her weather analysis techniques were deemed worthy of incorporation into advanced training curricula throughout the service. The official report described Sarah's decision-making as innovative, technically sound, and executed with exceptional skill. The language used in the investigation reflected recognition that her performance represented a new standard for weather flying capabilities and emergency response procedures. Based on the investigation's findings, Sarah was promoted to major and assigned as the squadron's chief of training, positions that would allow her to develop and implement the training programs based on her innovations. The promotion represented not only personal recognition, but institutional acknowledgement of the value of her contributions. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sarah's story was the transformation of her relationship with Captain Morrison. The pilot who had initially questioned her judgment requested an assignment as her deputy for training development, recognizing that working with her would help him address gaps in his own preparation and decision-making. Morrison's willingness to subordinate himself to someone he had previously criticized demonstrated exceptional professional integrity and personal growth. His transformation from skeptic to advocate became an example of how professional relationships could evolve when based on objective assessment rather than preconceived notions. Their collaboration proved highly effective, combining Sarah's innovative techniques with Morrison's practical experience and systematic approach to risk management. Together, they developed training programs that prepared pilots for challenges that had previously been considered beyond their capabilities. Lieutenant Ana Vasquez, a young engineering officer, became a key partner in developing the technical aspects of Sarah's training innovations. Her expertise in radar systems and weather analysis equipment helped translate Sarah's techniques into standardized procedures that could be taught to pilots with varying levels of technical background. Sarah's rescue mission led to the development of comprehensive training programs that transformed how the Air Force approached weather flying and emergency procedures. Her techniques for analyzing complex meteorological data became standard curriculum at pilot training bases throughout the military. The training programs combined theoretical knowledge with practical application, ensuring that pilots understood both the capabilities and limitations of their equipment. Sarah's innovations made advanced weather flying techniques accessible to operational pilots who didn't have extensive engineering backgrounds. The first major test of the new training approach came 6 weeks later, when another severe weather system moved through the Nevada desert.
Instead of grounding all flights, the squadron was able to continue operations using Sarah's enhanced weather analysis techniques, with pilots navigating through the storm system with confidence and complete safety. Morrison's performance during this second weather challenge was particularly noteworthy. Using the techniques Sarah had taught him, he successfully led a four-ship formation through conditions similar to those that had nearly killed him during the original emergency. 3 months after the rescue, Sarah was invited to brief senior Air Force leadership at the Pentagon on her weather flying techniques and emergency procedures. The audience included the Chief of Staff, Major Command Commanders, and heads of various training organizations, officers whose decisions would affect thousands of pilots throughout the service. Sarah's presentation was comprehensive and compelling, addressing not only the technical aspects of her innovations, but their strategic implications for Air Force capabilities. Enhanced weather flying would allow the service to maintain operational readiness in conditions that currently grounded aircraft, while improved emergency procedures would reduce aircraft losses and save pilots' lives. The questions from senior leadership were sophisticated and probing, reflecting genuine interest in the practical applications of her work. General Martinez, the Air Force Chief of Staff, was particularly interested in the resource requirements and timeline for implementing enhanced training programs across all fighter squadrons. Following her presentation, General Martinez authorized immediate implementation of Sarah's training programs across all fighter wings, meaning that her techniques would become standard operating procedures throughout the Air Force, affecting the training and capabilities of thousands of pilots. The story follows Sarah's career over the following decades as her innovations continued to influence military aviation. She advanced to become a general officer, ultimately serving as superintendent of the Air Force Academy, where she shaped the development of future generations of military aviators. Her weather flying techniques and emergency procedures were adopted not only by the Air Force, but by the Navy and Marine Corps as well. The innovations extended beyond military aviation to influence civilian flight training and safety practices, demonstrating how individual excellence could create benefits that transcended institutional boundaries. Morrison's career also flourished as he became one of the Air Force's leading experts in flight safety and risk management. His transformation from conservative risk avoider to innovative problem solver served as an example of how professional relationships could foster mutual growth and development. Lieutenant Vasquez advanced to become a senior engineer and eventually worked with NASA on space exploration vehicle development, carrying forward the collaborative approach to innovation that had characterized her early work with Sarah. Beyond the technical innovations, Sarah's story represents broader changes in military culture and institutional approaches to talent development. Her experience demonstrated the importance of objective assessment based on demonstrated performance rather than assumptions about capabilities. The rescue mission became a case study in leadership development and professional growth, taught at military academies and leadership courses throughout the armed forces. It illustrated how individual courage and competence could overcome institutional barriers and create opportunities for systemic improvement. Sarah's success influenced how the military approached diversity and inclusion, demonstrating that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources when institutional cultures supported merit-based evaluation and opportunity distribution. 20 years after the original rescue mission, Sarah's influence could be seen in pilots around the world who applied her techniques in challenging situations. Her innovations had become so thoroughly integrated into military aviation culture that many pilots used her methods without knowing their origin. The F-16 aircraft she flew during the rescue mission was eventually retired and placed in the Air and Space Force Museum, as a testament to the partnership between pilot and machine that had saved Morrison's life and launched a career of innovation. Young pilots visiting the museum could see interactive displays that allowed them to experience simulated versions of the challenges Sarah had faced, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of preparation, evaluation, and professional courage in overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles. Sarah's story offers profound lessons about the nature of excellence and leadership in challenging environments. Her experience demonstrates that competence and courage can overcome any barrier, that preparation and analysis can expand the boundaries of what's possible, and that individual achievement can create opportunities for countless others. The transformation of her relationship with Morrison illustrates how professional partnerships can evolve dramatically when based on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Their collaboration showed that apparent conflicts could become sources of strength when approached with open minds and genuine commitment to improvement. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah's career demonstrates that lasting progress requires not only individual excellence, but systematic approaches to training, evaluation, and opportunity distribution. Her innovations succeeded because they addressed real operational needs and provided practical solutions that could be taught and replicated. The storm that Sarah flew through at Nellis lasted only a few hours, but the changes it catalyzed created clear skies that would benefit countless pilots for decades to come. Her story proves that a single moment of courage and competence can transform not only personal trajectories, but the capabilities and culture of entire institutions. From captain to general, from questioned competence to recognized expertise, from individual achievement to systemic influence, each step of Sarah's journey built upon foundations of technical excellence and professional courage that were tested during a single afternoon of challenging weather. The silence of doubt was broken that day over the Nevada desert, replaced by the clear communication of competence and the lasting legacy of innovation that continues to guide military aviators around the world. If you enjoyed this incredible story of courage, innovation, and transformation, please subscribe to our channel where we bring you more amazing tales of aviation, military history, and the remarkable individuals who push the boundaries of what's possible. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories of excellence that inspire us all to reach higher and fly further. Because in the sky, as in life, silence is never forgotten, but legends live forever.